Well, hello, everyone.
Hello,
Hello, Gil. Nice to see you.
same here.
Are there any questions before we begin? How's everyone doing this week? It's awkward because everyone is supposed to be muted when they come in. So it's unlike when you go into a classroom and they're talking among themselves, or you say, "How are we doing?" and they can answer, "Why don't I unmute everybody?" And we'll suffer with the background noise if it happens. How is everyone this week?
Doing good.
I'm
Good.
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 Good. Are there any questions before we begin?
Nope.
Okay.
Oh,
Well, yes.
I have questions about the books that we have to buy for class. I haven't gone around that because it's been hard to like find any copies of them.
Well, you don't actually have to, well, I guess because the libraries aren't functioning. Um, if you can find, let me know. Why don't you call me after class and we can talk about what to do about it. Are other people having problems finding the books? It's okay if you,
I found the books. It just has been taking some time for me to get them from the bookstore.
okay, that's
I
understandable.
found the what's it called? Indians in Unexpected Places.
Yes.
But it said that's gonna take about a week or two to.
Okay, we won't need it before then.
Yeah.
The one we want to read for next week is Anton Troyer's book, Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask. Gil, have you read that?
What?
Anton Troyer's book, Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask.
No, I know everything about that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, you don't need to know much, but this is mainly for people who aren't Indians too.
Right.
He gives a lot of talks and he said, these are the questions people ask afterward.
Right.
And some of them are probably the same questions you've been answering when you've
Correct.
spoken. So he'll be visiting with us next week. So I hope you will have more questions to ask him then, and you won't be afraid to ask. Well, we're really honored tonight to have a guest, Gill Solomon, who is the Sachem of the Massachusetts Ponkopoag. And I always learn a lot when I hear from him. I didn't want to put you on the spot, but last week we just had a very general introduction to Native American history up to about 1830. And if you do have questions that you are afraid to ask or not afraid to ask, he is really the guy. He's one of the most knowledgeable people I know anyway, and I always learn a lot whenever I hear him talk about anything. So I really thank you for joining us. And I hope that over the course of the semester, you'll want to sit in occasionally and correct things I have said that you know to be wrong or misinterpreted, or otherwise to help us all learn more about Native Americans. So thank you for coming.
May I make a simple comment?
Yes, of course.
Brief comment.
Okay.
Since tonight's subject is about the Indian Removal Act or the Trail of Tears, or whatever,
Yeah.
however you want to address that
Yeah.
subject, all of you should understand that it did not begin with the Cherokee. It began in Massachusetts in 1875. The first Native Americans were removed from their homelands and put in a prison camp on an island called Deer Island in 1875. So
Yes.
it wasn't something that was that began in the 1800s. It was something that the United States did with intent. And whatever they found successful in Massachusetts, they imported it or exported it to the rest of the country.
That is true. I mean, Massachusetts does take credit for a lot of things, but we also, don't take credit for the negative things that have happened. And so this was in the wake of King Philip's War, which was one of the bloodiest wars in American history per capita, something like 9,000 casualties altogether on both sides. And do you want to say more about King Philip's War, or do you want to, since...
Well, only that it's a misnomer. It wasn't
Yes.
King Philip's War. It was his attempt to take back what the invaders were stealing. So, but it wasn't really a war. And had he had the foresight of we all would have, he knew he should have understood, might have understood that was it was something that could not end good would not end well for him and the people and all of the rest of the people in the country, because
That's true. Yeah, and it's almost hard to imagine different outcomes for this. We see it was in the course of teaching, say, colonial America, we have these wars between Europeans and Native people that typically do begin over a misunderstanding. I mean, you can see the big causes that the Europeans want the land, which the Native people have. And then usually there is a misunderstanding. Someone gets into a fight with someone else, and then that provokes counterattacks on each side, retaliation, and so on. And we can see saying, okay, well, maybe someone could have calmed down, but it doesn't happen. You have this perpetuation of this warfare, and it's it's. So let me just ask you, Gill. You grew up as a Massachusetts, but you work in the technology field, I believe. And
Correct.
So you had this life aside from being a Native person, or what is life like for a Native person in New England in 21st century?
I think the idea that I proposed, and probably wasn't original to me, that as a Native person in America, you live in two worlds. You have a foot in one world and a foot in the other world. You have to honor your ancestors and the people the people that you grew up with, or in your family mostly, don't understand if they're elders. Your grandparents didn't understand. So with my foot in the technology world as a network engineer, there was nothing that was akin to being in the spiritual world of the Native American. And the primary misconception between the invaders and the originators of this land, at least as far as most people would agree, was that Native people did not believe in ownership. You could not own the land. So when a treaty was, or an agreement was formalized, the Native people could not understand, well, wait a minute, what are you putting up a fence for? This has always been the place where we farmed or hunted, but the all of the so-called treaties or memorandum of understanding, if you like, was not an agreement between the Native people and the invaders, because it was written in their language, the invaders' language, and it wasn't the primary language of the Native people. Although in Cambridge or at Harvard, there was a Native American school. Actually, Harvard was an Indian college before it was a university. And there were people who learned English and could understand English, but as far as broad concepts of the law in terms of the English law, those were not truly understood. They were there were concepts, but they were not concepts that the Native people understood completely. So when the Native people were, I would say in most cases, coerced into signing something, it wasn't a signature, it was an X or a diphthong or something that was not.
Yes.
Was
I've just
not,
been, yeah.
yeah, okay. So
I've just been reading today about the Black Hawk War, and there's a treaty in 1804 between these people and the Americans. And what is written down is not what the Native people had heard. And I think that's a persistent thing, that, we hear one thing, but what's written down is something else. And again, it is controlling the written word that I think is really critical here, because for Europeans, this is the critical thing, is what's written on the piece of paper, whereas it's what you hear is the important thing. And plus, each side has these such fundamental understandings of how the world works, and they weren't living in an era where you think, well, someone else may see things differently. It's just, this is the way the world is, and to neither side did what the other was doing make sense. Now, how did you get into the world of software engineering? I'm just curious, because you're living in two worlds, and
well, I had, as many people do in their work life, have had many opportunities in many different fields. So
Yeah.
I started off one place, and as all of you young folks will find, that you may not end up where you started off with, even though you may have a degree in that particular field, you may not end up where you want to be. So for me, sometime during the 60s, I become enthralled with computers. So I built my own computer. I was fortunate enough to get in on the ground floor. And when I went to work with a large insurance company, I convinced the management of that company, or at least the local place, that they needed to have a network. So I built the network and had so much fun. I would tell them, hey, listen, I'll do this for nothing because it's so much fun. So that's how I moved from all the other jobs I had as a salesman and what else did I do? A manager of a manufacturing firm, and got into the world of where we are today. That everything is virtual. Most everything is virtual.
Right. Yeah.
Really, everything in computing is ones and zeros, and if you can't contemplate that it doesn't matter whether you think it's right. If it's not a 1 or a 0, it doesn't matter. It's not right, and it's not going to work. So that appealed to my sense of logic, I guess. Is how I moved into that field, because it was a logical progression, as my wife would say if she were here. Yes, that's right, Gill. You can't feel. You don't have any feelings. No, that's
logic.
Yep.
So talking about the other world you're in, how did you become the Sachem of the Massachusetts?
Well, my mother was, because she's passed now, was a native person, and she grew up in Ponkopoag, and Ponkopoag was a praying town. If that concept is not familiar, well, I'll share it with you. But she grew up in Ponkopoag, which is in Stoughton, Canton, part of lots of places just south of Boston. And her family that she grew up with they were also living in two worlds, because that when my mother was born in the 1900s, by that time Ponkopoag was assimilated into America, and there were no more Indians. And there was several times where she would say, see this, the last Indian. How many times are they going to say the last Indian? So her world was similar to ours today, that she was not a princess. She didn't grow up in a wigwam. She grew up on the land where her great grandmother, who we all called the little grandma, she was one of the last of the Ponkopoags, but that was not foremost in her mind, because when we as young people would say, tell us about the Indians, Mama, tell us about what it was like. She said, I don't want to talk about those drunks. That's all they were. They were drunk and fighting all the time, because that's what she was left with. So when we decided as a group, started with my family, and there were other Native people in Massachusetts, trust me, there's the Wampanoags who have the federal recognition, and the Nipmuc who were in Western Massachusetts. But we had been the first group. The Massachusetts were the first to encounter first the Pilgrims, and then the people of Salem, not Salem. What's north of Boston? When did the second ship come in?
It did come into Salem. Yeah, Endicott.
Was it Salem? Yeah.
Yeah, Endicott went to Salem, and then John Smith had been here earlier, which is why he called it the Bay of the Massachusetts.
Yes.
These were the first people he encountered in 1614.
That's true.
And,
so when my family, my nephews, met another man who said he was a punk, and we would go around, never heard of the punk. Who the punk was? We never heard of them. And that's true. Nobody has ever heard of them. No, that's not true. That's not true. But once I would say, yes, I'm a Ponkopoag, they'd say, what's that? Who's that? Where are you? And ultimately we learned by researching our history, that we're the Massachusetts, not the Ponkopoag, we're the Massachusetts. And the Massachusetts was a huge confederation with thousands of people, and all of the leaders fell afoul of the colonists, or the invaders, as I like to call them. And there were very few persons who could speak the language, and there were very few communities who were still keeping that community, because we were in the place where America first was founded. We're in Massachusetts. Where did it begin? It began in Massachusetts. So the native people were eliminated or marginalized, and ultimately we had to assimilate, because no assimilation, you were going to be dead. Fortunately, some of the folks, native people who were south of us, because they lived on Cape Cod, if you've ever been there and put a spade in the earth, it's mostly sand. It is not a desirable area. The trees are just, what do they call it? Scrub pine.
Scrub pine, yeah, yeah.
And the larger trees that were wanted by the invaders for timber were in north of us, or actually around here in Bridgewater, where I live. So as my family, or actually my nephews, said, we want to be a tribe, Uncle. And we found some people who helped us discover our past, and we operated in a semi-formal way, once a month meeting. And I began to lead. I guess I became the leader. And at one point in time, we were at a Nakomo, which is similar to a powwow. I found something in Bridgewater by walking through the words and communing with the Creator, and say, it would be nice if I could find something here where our people once were. And lo and behold, on top of this hill, and I picked up a rock, and it had some inscriptions on it, and I was flabbergasted what I found that had been there for I don't know how long. And I brought it back to the group, and I said, pass this around, don't say anything, just pass it around. And we were talking, blah, 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 blah. And then I think it was my sister and my cousin, who were both females and had their way of leading, said, we want you to be the chief. And I said, well, no, we want you to be the chief because you've been doing that all along. And I said, okay, but you have to know, we're not chiefs. It's Sachem. Sachem or Sagamo, which have the same root word. And so if you want me to be the leader, you need to address me as the Sachem. And that's how I moved from the world of business into the world of spirit. And that is the world of spirit. That help?
Yeah. So how many are there in the Ponkopoag?
The number of people who have asked for membership are about 500 or so, and they're all across the country. I have a daughter in California, and I have a son in New York, and so all of them who can trace their ways. There was a census done called the Earl Report, when somebody at one of the governors, I don't know which governor, said, we want to know about all the Native people in the community on the Commonwealth. So a census was done, and that census was a basis of membership in the tribe. If you were counted as an Indian back when that census was done, that's all you need to be. That's all you need to justify as to be a member of the tribe.
Okay. Now, Ponkopoag was one of the praying towns set up by.
It was the second one. The first one was Natick,
Right.
And it still is Natick, and the second one was Ponkopoag, and there are many others. Most all of the towns and cities in Massachusetts. Most, I'm not saying all. Most of them started as an Indian village. Most of them did. So because that's where the good fishing was, or that's what the good hunting was. That's what the good
Right.
arable land was.
Yeah. And you can see a lot of the roads do follow what would have been the logical way to
Trail.
get from point A to point B.
That's right.
And it was, I think it was in the wake of the Pequot War in the 1630s when these Puritans came with the idea that they were bringing the gospel. That is, they were helping people. In fact, they have on the seal, "Come over and help us." This is a native person saying
That is such a misnomer. That no native person would have said, "Come over and help us."
No.
And that was on the state flag for. It's probably still there in spirit, but we are trying to change the flag now in Massachusetts, so it doesn't say that.
Yeah. So you're in favor of removing the Indian from the flag?
Removing not necessarily removing the Indian, removing the concept of the sword
Okay.
over his head, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's gone from the flag. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
But yeah, it is. And imagining that this is what the native people, and then they have this big war, and it's horrific for the native people, the Pequots in Connecticut. And remember, these are not all moral hypocrites, the Puritans, and some of them think we came over the idea of helping these people, and instead we're killing them. Maybe we should do something else. And this is when John Eliot begins the process of learning the language and translating the Bible so that we can bring this, and then setting up towns, because the thinking was, if you're a native person, you can't live as a native person and also believe in our God. You have to change your way of life. And because they were very different ways of life among the Europeans. One thing, believed in eating 3 times a day, whether you're hungry or not. And the hunting is kind of a pastime for gentlemen. Men should be doing agricultural work. And my understanding is most of the agricultural work among native people is done by women.
Correct.
Well, why do you make the women do all the work? And so men shouldn't be going hunting. Instead, you should raise cattle. And cattle wreak all kinds of havoc on the native livestock as well as the habitat for wild animals. So the idea is we'll convert them, but it's not just, okay, on Sundays you'll come to our church, change your way of life and live in these villages in Natick, Ponkopoag, Mashpee. And so that's really the impetus for this. And as you were saying earlier, you do have to assimilate or you'll die, because we have this overwhelming number of people coming. And but then holding on to this identity is really, I think, one of the phenomenal things. That here we are in 2020. When I went to college many years ago, we would study the Pequot War, and we would learn that all of the Pequots were eliminated in the war or sold into slavery and were no more. And this is why Herman Melville called his whaling ship the Pequot, because it's a Spanish group. But then the Pequots are back. I mean, they have a casino, and they are really doing much what you are doing in reviving these people from the scattered remnants. And that, I think, is an amazing story. It's the fact that in the 20th century, the native population actually began to rebound for the first time really since 1492, when it had been falling with the arrival of Europeans. And so finding, your next generation who look to you now as an elder, wanting to carry on this spiritual side of life. I mean, you put it very well, that this is a spiritual identity is the central thing. I don't know if I have a question for you, or if I've just been pontificating and telling you things either you already know or you've already heard and disagree with. But that, I think, is really an amazing story about the revival of Native identity in the 20th and 21st century.
What, honey?
What are you doing? I need you. I'm starting something out. Do I have to
Okay.
wait?
All right, I'm going to have to leave you now.
Okay, well, thank you for joining us.
Yep, and I'll see you.
Hope to see you again. Great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Now, how do I get out here?
Good. Okay. Good. Well, he's very interesting. Hope he's no longer listening. Okay. So now that he's no longer with us, anyone have any questions you would like to ask him? I'll unmute everybody. Okay, well, think about it. So if he comes back, you can ask. So I think last time I started talking about and it was this issue that Gill was talking about, this whole issue of assimilation as a strategy. And you had the Cherokee really pursuing this in the early 19th century. They adopted a written constitution which set up a council, an elected council that would guide this society. And they create the Cherokee Nation, relying on the boundaries set by the treaties that the Cherokee had made with the United States, which stipulated what land would be of the Cherokee. And let me just see while I am talking if I can find this. Speaking of computers, just before class, I was fighting with mine, and so I, in frustration, might have thrown everything in a place where I can't find it. Okay. Let's see, in addition to battery is running.
Did he leave?
What happened?
Looks like
That's down the voicemail.
All right. I'll be the new professor. We're good for the semester. We're done.
We're done.
We're done.
Leave. Alright, that's smooth. I'm gonna see y'all in a year.
Do we like wait or
Yeah.
might come
he
back?
probably got like booted off.
Yeah,
Yo,
I think he got
Pause
kicked
the
off.
recording for this class. What? I mean, I'm really not trying to be here for another 2 hours. So.
Yeah.
Background noise, honestly.
Yeah, bullshit. He just decided to be out. Right.
How's the meeting still recording if he's gone?
Cause I'm host now.
Oh.
Yeah, I can send everybody to breakout rooms. Oh shit, what the hell? This shit crazy.
Wow. All right. This is pretty much what I expected from online classes. I'm gonna be completely honest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was anybody did the readings or whatever?
Readings? Like
Yeah.
the books?
Yeah.
I didn't get them yet.
Yeah.
I didn't get them yet either.
So nobody got them yet. Cause I thought I was the only one who was like still don't got nothing on.
Oh no, dude. I'm gonna look for the PDFs online. I'm not paying for it.
I'll hop on. Alright, smooth.
Who else heard that guy get yelled at by his wife?
What?
Who else heard that guy get yelled at by?
That was so random.
Like, what are you doing?
It's like, I need you for supper. It's fun.
Apologies.
Should have left me as host.
Where did I leave off? Okay, so have you ever had one of those days that just keeps getting stranger? No. Well, that's what I'm having now. And I almost hit the end meeting for all button here as I'm trying to share my screen with you. Okay, let's try this again. This is where we were last time when I shut everything down. If you run into the dean, don't tell her about this, please. So the Cherokee, living roughly where you can see this yellow in the southeast, they're Iroquoian speakers. So those essentially are the boundaries of the Cherokee Nation. Some of them actually lived in northwestern Georgia. This is an earlier map, and here actually is a better map showing where they were. And what you see surrounding them are counties in the state of Georgia. And as I said, the Cherokee see all of these white people coming, and they're planting cotton, and the Cherokee realize they can plant cotton too and sell it. And they're trying to do a couple of things. One is they're trying to preserve their autonomy and also hold on to their land, which is one reason why they create a constitution for the Cherokee Nation, real reason that they have been recognized, they've been recognized by the United States as holding this territory. Now, the problem for the Cherokee is that the state of Georgia very much wants their land, and Georgia has had its eye on this land for a long time. And in fact, one of the reasons why back in the late 1780s, Georgia had been really anxious to ratify the United States Constitution was they thought this government would help them get the land away from the Cherokee and actually fight with them against the Cherokee who had been at war with them. The Cherokee sided with the British during the American Revolution. And then, yes, question?
Yeah, I just had a question why this land, like in particular, was so valuable to them. Like,
I can't understand all of it, Trevor.
Can you hear me?
I can turn up my sound.
Can you hear me?
Barely. I'm sorry. I'm trying to find my full screen to do that. Okay. So you're using the chat. Actually, that's a good question. And some of it is and some of it isn't. For Georgia, again, are you more familiar with, there are the mountains, but then these valleys where the rivers are is quite fertile. And that's the land they're interested in. Plus, you see the mountains up here, but along these rivers that are flowing west and south, you see that's actually very good land there. And the other thing to remember is there's quite a lot of it. So you're right, they're not really interested in the mountainous areas, but they are interested in these big rivers and very fertile valleys. And so that is really the draw here. And Georgia considered itself the Empire State. And it was, at the time of the ratification of the Constitution, it saw itself as becoming the largest state in the country. And in fact, it claimed all of the land to the Mississippi River. And so Georgia early on sees itself moving. Now, Georgia has this long-running attempt to get the land away from the Cherokee, and it's in the 1820s, at the same time that you see the Cherokee forming their constitution, that this is all going to come to a head. I should mention that in the 1825 or so, the Creek Indians, who were in Alabama, and Alabama had been split off from Georgia, and the Creeks, I think I mentioned last time, and I have this recurring nightmare, and you may be having it too, that every week I'm just going to say the same thing I said last week, and we'll never get any further than 1828. The Creek had fought a war against the United States in 1811 to 1814, and the Cherokee had sided with the United States, but the Creek had lost most of their land. Then in 1825, the remaining land that the Creek held in the central part of Alabama, the state of Alabama claimed. And what Alabama would simply do is send surveyors in and sell the land. So you may be a Creek who's been living here, and now suddenly someone else shows up and says, this is my land, I bought it. And the militia will come and clear you out. So you have the Creek protests to the United States government about this. And President John Quincy Adams sides with the Creek against the state of Alabama. However, the Creek had just fought this big war against the United States. They don't have a lot of political allies, and it turns out President Adams didn't have a whole lot of allies either. The Congress wasn't ready to concede land in Alabama to the Creeks. Now, the Cherokee were different because the Cherokee had been allies of the United States. They had sided with the United States in the War of 1812 against the Creek. But now Georgia very much wants the Creek land. And so the Cherokee land, and the Cherokee see this. They see this coming, which is one reason why they propose a code of laws and a new constitution. And another real innovation that the Cherokee do in this period is to create a written language. Now, let me see, I know I have here the syllabary. Oh, by the way, so this is that same area of the Cherokee country. You can see these rivers running through it. And now it's been divided up into parcels. So these parcels can be sold. This isn't the first time this happened. I should have brought you the map showing upstate New York. In 1773, there's a great map of upstate New York showing it's the Iroquois territory, and then during the course of the war, American soldiers do invade the Iroquois country and destroy the Seneca's fruit crops and so on. And then there's a map in the early 1790s. That land divided up and sold as a way of paying the soldiers who had fought. So here in Georgia, we have the Cherokee territory, and here it's on the map, it's the Cherokee Indians, and here is Cherokee County. I think this river is probably the one you see marked the western boundary the eastern boundary of the Cherokee Nation. So you have the state of Georgia seeing this much differently, and the Cherokee formed their constitution at the same time as they've also created a written language, and they have a newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix. And the Phoenix, do you know what a Phoenix is? Why they would call it? Okay. Okay, so was Trevor, in case that people don't see what rising from the ashes mean, could you elaborate on what a phoenix is? Does everyone know what a phoenix is? You can raise your hand using the chat feature. If Alexandra knows what a phoenix is. Okay, so rising from the ashes, the phoenix bird rises from the ashes. Okay. Am I belaboring a point that is so obvious you want to move on to something else? Okay. It's one of the difficult things of being on Zoom is I really can't read the room as well as I would like. So the Cherokee Phoenix is published. Some of the articles are in English and some are in the Cherokee language. Now, I mentioned when I was talking to Gill about being translated into the Massachusetts language. And that was taking the words and transliterating them, using the alphabet and spelling out the words. So if you couldn't read knew what each letter has a sound, you had no idea what this meant. So one way of translating a language is to do that. Take an alphabet that's in use in other languages and simply spell out your words in this. And there are a few major alphabets in the world: English, Arabic, or Latin, I should say, Arabic, Slavic, and then some languages are based on characters: Chinese, Japanese, Korean. And it was a Cherokee named Sequoia who developed a way of taking the syllables, the sounds, and applying them. It's one reason why some words sound differently or are pronounced differently in the native languages as opposed to English. And you see different transliterations of things because people who grow up speaking a certain language only use the sounds that you use in that language. It's something. Is anyone here a linguist? Let me ask another question. Does anyone here speak more than one language? Type in an answer if you do. So, Chadi, what languages do you speak?
Arabic and French.
Okay. Do you know, and also English, do you notice differences among these three languages?
Oh yeah, a lot. Not much between. I mean, French and English are like. I mean, the letters are the same, so it's easier. But Arabic, it's like a whole different thing. You gotta like start. Learn the alphabets are different. The way you say things is different.
What is your first language? What was the first language you learned?
Arabic and French are my first language. English is my third language.
Okay. And where did you learn Arabic and French?
The Middle East. I lived there for 8-9 years. So that's what they taught us in school.
Okay. But you also grew up speaking in the home or in the family?
Yeah. I grew up speaking Arabic basically, and then English was more it's more like Spanish in the U.S. Like that's how they taught us English in the Middle East. So yeah.
Interesting. And Alessandro, what languages do you speak?
English, Italian, and a little bit of Spanish.
Okay. Now, how did you learn Italian?
Both of my parents and my grandmother spoke it to me my entire childhood, and I just learned it, more vocally than written. But in Spanish, I learned it at school, and that I know a lot better written than how I know Italian written.
Yeah. Okay, good. Now, I sent you the other day, last week, and I hope you still have it, the Cherokee syllabary. And let me see if I can find it again here. I meant to send it out again and neglected to. Maybe I didn't save it. Here we go. So this is the Cherokee syllabary. And you can see that it has the columns beginning with the D, what looks like the letter D at the top, and then the letter R and the T and the other symbol, and then another symbol that looks like, and then what looks like letter I. And then next to that is actually the sound. So this is a way to convey the sounds of the Cherokee language so that you can have the symbol down, remember, it's written correct symbols. There's no reason why the letter A should necessarily sound the way it does. And in fact, in different places, it sounds differently. In fact, there are lots of different pronunciations for it. But you can see these other than blends of consonants. As you get further down, there are, and so the top, these are simply the vowels. And then you get to the consonant blends, the ga or ka, the g, the gi, the go, the gu, the gu. That is these different uses of essentially a G-A sound, G-E sound, and then the H sound. And so that's the way this is structured. And the idea is you learn the symbol that goes along with each sound. And then you can write down actually what you're saying. Because the Cherokee did not have a written language, and they realized this was a great disadvantage, that they would have to translate everything into English, and because the people writing the treaties and making trading spoke English, everything was in English, and they seemed to write things down, and this writing things down gave a certain power to them. And Sequoia does come up with this way of conveying these sounds with symbols that you can remember, and then you can write down these symbols, and then someone else who understands how they sound will know what it is you're saying. So this is a way the Cherokee learned to write things down. And that's, someone can write something down in one place. You would have to rely on a messenger to carry the message, but people do forget or change things. Here, if it's something written down, you know exactly what it was that was said. So this is a fascinating thing. It's actually one of the few times that someone does develop a language like this, using this syllabary, which is I don't know, I certainly wouldn't be able to figure something like how to do something like this, how to create this using the sounds of the language. So I think what we'll do now, just as a way of giving you something to do rather than either listening to me or watching me try to figure out how to run the computer, is we'll break into groups. If you don't have this, let me know and I'll send it out again. But what I'd like everyone to do is take a few minutes using this and write your name in the Cherokee syllabary, remembering the characters in the columns on the left, that's the symbol, and the typed letters next to it is the sound. So it's based on the sound as opposed to other things the language might be based on. So that's our next assignment, is to try to figure out the Cherokee syllabary. Let me just see if I can put us into groups so that we can do that. I think I want to. Are there any questions? Is it clear what it is we're doing? I know last time I put you into groups and didn't really tell you what it was you were doing, and you still did very well. Let me just see if I can get back to the full screen. Okay, so I'm going to put you into rooms, assigning you into, there are 11 people, so we'll give us 4 rooms. Okay. And working with each other. And Savannah, you haven't joined your room yet.
The Cherokee would have even attempted to say my name.
But Trevor, you don't think there are many Trevors in Cherokee country? No.
Probably not.
Well, Sana, we just had the Cherokee syllabary, and everyone tried to translate their name into Cherokee. So,
Okay.
um, what was the problem with getting a translation of your name, Trevor?
There just aren't very like hard sounds. They're all like a lot softer. So I had to settle for like Twavo.
Twavo.
Mm.
Okay. You sound like
I
you're
think
not
that was
happy.
the closest.
Yeah.
No, if they call me that, I'll be fine with it. But that was the closest I could get.
Okay. Let's see. Harrison and Alessandro, you also were having interesting observations on it. Harrison, how did you make out with your name?
I basically gave up on my first name.
Really?
Yeah, well, I have 2 R's and there's no R's at all in the language. I got like hoot, I guess, basically with my last name though. I had trouble finding the like a hard end that would flow good to like the last half of my name. So, yeah.
Interesting. Well, so yeah. And Jeffrey, how are you doing? You had a similar kind of issue with the sound, right?
Yeah, I kind of gave up on my first name and I was able to spell my last name basically.
Okay. How did your last name sound then?
It sounds pretty similar.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Good. And Alessandro, you also were struggling.
I mean, I made it sound very similar. My last name I got almost exactly. I just needed an R, but they didn't have
Really?
it. So,
Yeah.
but yeah,
That's interesting.
I worked with what I had.
So how did it sound? Can you say it as it would sound?
It's Alessanido Odoguadi.
That's very good. That's very close. Yeah. And then let's see, Alex, you were also you have the X. How did you work that out?
I couldn't really find anything that would match up with the X. The closest thing I could find was S, which is TSI, but that's about it.
Yeah. Now, did people find that there weren't ending vowels like Patrick? You were finding that to be true. That it's hard to get the K sound as an end.
Yeah, I had to end on the ka
for
that because there's no hard ending.
Yeah. And you also had the issue with the R. How would your name sound if you were going to try to use Patrick?
The best I could come up with was something like Casalika.
Okay. Interesting. Now, Harrison basically said he wouldn't, and Jeffrey said basically I won't use my first name because it's too complicated. You wanted to stick with that? Or...
well, if they want to call me Ha, yeah.
Let's see, Tessa, you had probably one of the easiest, I think.
Yeah, I got all the letters for my name.
Mm-hmm. Now, since that was easy, did you try your middle name?
Yeah, I got basically all of them except there's no R, so I just did the Lee sound.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, and let's see, Savannah, did you figure it out? The syllable, the last syllable was giving you trouble.
Yeah, I just chose the one that was like NA.
Okay, so how would it sound in Cherokee?
I didn't think this far.
That's the word, yes. Okay, let's see. Sam, you have a translate?
Yeah, I tried to do Samuel, but I couldn't really get the like last L sound.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess it would be like Samu. And then for my last name, Cooney, I guess like Kwoni. I guess like that would work, but
it's actually pretty close.
Yeah.
Mine came out as Savannah.
Savannah, that is quite close.
Yeah, so it's pretty close.
Yeah, good, very good. So this actually, it's not just taking a word and using different letters, because we're relying on sound, and it makes us think about the sounds that you have in one language that you don't have in another, and this attempt then to translate. And the Cherokee themselves, I think as I mentioned to a couple of you, Salage is how they would have said who they were, and it's spelled roughly T-S-A-L-A-G-I, because they don't have the CH sound or the R sound, just as English doesn't really have the TS sound, which other languages do. And some languages have clicks and other kinds of sounds that we don't have in English. And consequently, if you don't grow up speaking them, you're not really going to get them unless you're really good with this. So it's, it's really, when you're translating something, not just translating a word into something else, but things have their own meaning, and sounds have their own way of, being, and they fitting together in certain ways. Sometimes we saw they have consonants at the beginnings of words, but not at the ends of words. So it really should make us think about, translating other things that are even more complicated than something as simple as your name. If you can't get Trevor, it's like there are other things you're probably not going to get either. So good. I'm glad we did the Sana while we've been talking. Have you figured out how to do your name in Cherokee?
Well, what I've read wasn't like a soft J would be written as like CH or something, or sound like CH. And a soft, well, I don't know, maybe that was from the reading, like a soft B would be written.
No, in the syllabary, which we had, I'm sorry, I sent it to everybody and then I had it up on the screen. It has the symbol that goes with each sound. So what you're doing is taking that symbol and applying it to whatever the sounds in your name.
And you sent that to us?
Yeah. I'll send it. Okay. So you can work on it and translate your name, and maybe we'll do the final exam in Cherokee. Okay. It'll be fun for everybody. Okay, so the Cherokee do create a written language and also a written constitution, but at the same time, there is a push by Georgia to get them out of Georgia, and Georgia had been advocating for a long time. And in 1829, President Jackson takes office, and in his first annual message, he calls for the removal of the native people east of the Mississippi River and having them moved west of the Mississippi to what is today Oklahoma. But the idea was this will be set aside as Indian territory. So December 8th of 1829 is when Jackson delivers his first annual message to Congress. And Jackson is going to change lots of things. And one is Indian policy. And he has quite a lengthy statement about the native people, but he wants to set aside part of this territory west of Mississippi, and this will be guaranteed to these Indian tribes as long as they occupy it. Each tribe will have distinct control over the part designated for its use. He wants this migration to be voluntary, for it would be as cruel as unjust to compel the Aborigines to abandon the graves of their fathers and seek a home in a distant land. But they should be distinctly informed that if they remain within the limits of the states, they must be subject to state laws. In return for their obedience as individuals, they will without doubt be protected in the enjoyment of those possessions which they have improved for their industry. But it seems to me visionary to suppose that in this state of things, claims can be allowed on tracts of country on which they have neither dwelt nor made improvements, merely because they have seen them from the mountains or passed them in the chase. So he's saying the Cherokee can't claim the land that they claim because they haven't actually been living on it, all of it. And that we are going to make treaties with them, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Creek, as well as the Chickasaw, and then the Sac and the Fox, who are up in the Illinois and the Michigan, the state of Illinois, and the Michigan territory that now is the state of Wisconsin. Because these are the big groups remaining. And he makes a point that Georgia won't tolerate having Indians claiming to be a separate country within the state of Georgia any more than New York or Maine would allow the Iroquois or the Passamaquoddy to lay claim to parts of those states. There is more sympathy for the native people in Maine and New York than there is in Georgia. And so he's really playing that Georgia, New York wouldn't allow the Iroquois to claim most of New York, which they could. Yes, Sana, you have your hand raised.
So wasn't it what I learned last semester was Andrew Jackson's like a racist. Thomas Jefferson originally wanted to get rid of the Indians because they wanted to acquire more land. To my understanding, wasn't it because like they wanted the land and then like some of the Indians were already educated or something through the missionaries?
The Cherokee certainly were. I mean, John Ridge, who is one of the leaders of the Cherokee, his sons and nephews have gone to a boarding school in Connecticut.
Yeah.
They've, so yeah, and they've now developed a language.
But even if they were educated, they still didn't they're never going to win, basically.
Well, they're on this land that other people want.
But it's their land. Do you think it's okay?
Also claimed by the state of Georgia. And
Georgia was doing illegal activity, though, weren't they?
Well, not according to Georgia. And now according to Jackson. Jackson's saying, you can't be a separate state in the state of Georgia. And Georgia agrees. And Congress, a couple of things happen. One is Congress in early 1830 passes the Indian Removal Act, basically making this law. The state of Georgia also divides up the Cherokee, what the Cherokee Nation claims as the Cherokee Nation, into counties. And so we're trying, the Jackson administration is trying to get the Cherokee to sign a treaty by which they'll give up this land in Georgia in return for land in Oklahoma. Then Georgia extends state law over the Cherokee country. And what happens is this, the Cherokee have not yet signed a treaty.
I wouldn't either.
Because actually, according to Cherokee law, the council is not allowed to sell land. And land can't be sold unless everyone agrees. So they run into this. Now, what happens among the Cherokee in 1829, 1830 is a Cherokee named Corntassel kills another Cherokee, which sometimes happens. And the Cherokee have laws about what happens when you kill someone. You have to make some kind of restitution. However, the state of Georgia has a different set of laws about what happens when you kill someone. You're put on trial for murder, and then if you're found guilty, you're hanged. So the Cherokee say the state of Georgia doesn't have any power over Corntassel. He's tried by Cherokee law. He is taken out of the Cherokee territory, tried according to Georgia law, and he is sentenced to be hanged. The Cherokee Nation appeals this to the Supreme Court. They say this is a violation of their jurisdiction. At this time, remember, the Supreme Court did not hear appeals of murder convictions. This is a state matter. However, the Cherokee Nation says, no, this is a matter affecting the sovereignty of the Cherokee Nation. And so the Supreme Court says, okay, we'll hear the case. The state of Georgia doesn't send anyone to argue the case. They say the Supreme Court has no say in this matter. They can't review murder trials that happened in Georgia courts. However, the Cherokee Nation finds a very good lawyer. In fact, he was the former Attorney General, William Wirt, who argued that the Cherokee actually are a sovereign entity, and thus the state of Georgia cannot try people for murder, Cherokees for murder that happened in the Cherokee territory. And the Supreme Court is somewhat divided. Two justices say, yes, the Cherokee are right. Georgia has no business making these laws. The majority of the court disagrees. And Chief Justice Marshall writes the opinion of the court, which essentially says, he says, you really wish you could find for the Cherokee. But, he says, the Cherokee do not have standing to sue in federal court because they aren't really, they're not American citizens.
Yeah, and that's when that guy goes in, right? And then they're like, well, we're American citizens, so we can do it.
What happens later, the next case involves someone who is an American citizen. This case involves the Cherokee Nation, and the court says that they are domestic dependent nations. So they're similar to an underage person who has a guardian.
Yep.
They have that same relationship. So the Cherokee Nation can't sue. And Marshall says there's probably not a case better excited to arouse our sympathies. Because here we find these people who used to be in possession of all this territory, and now look at them. Marshall is very sympathetic to the Indians, but he's also saying they're in this race of civilizations that they're losing. And he wishes he could find a way for the court to make an argument that says, yeah, the Cherokee are right. But then they do, because there are two guys, Samuel Worcester and another guy, who had arrived in the Cherokee Nation back in 1820 as missionaries. And in fact, they had a license from President Monroe to go to the Cherokee Nation. The state of Georgia passed a law that said white people can't live in the Cherokee Nation without the permission of the state of Georgia. And Worcester's not there with the permission of the state of Georgia. And Georgia wouldn't have wanted them there because he's there advocating for the Cherokee.
Yep.
He's helped set up the printing press and do other things. And so he is arrested. And so now he is arrested by the state of Georgia for trespassing. And he now is an American citizen. So the case of Worcester versus Georgia comes before the case court the next year. And the court makes a similar decision to what Marshall had wanted to make the previous year, that the state of Georgia cannot extend its power over the Cherokee Nation and can't get Samuel Worcester out. And this is a case, so the court has found essentially for the Cherokee Nation, but Marshall understands this and Jackson understands this. The president's not going to force Georgia out of the Cherokee Nation for a couple of reasons. One, Santa mentioned, Jackson had ideas about race that are different from hers. By her definition, then they're awful.
He is. Jackson was known as the president that would. He was such a he was like, what was the word? It's like he just had a lot of power, and so he could do what he wants. Like he's like a really crappy president,
I don't think he was a crappy president.
Oh, are you about Jackson?
I do know about Jackson.
Oh my God, he's awful. So
he's representing the people who elected them.
Yeah.
And he's challenging the status quo. He's doing all kinds of things that, I had a student a couple of years ago who loved both Bernie Sanders and Andrew Jackson. I don't quite know how that worked, but
yeah.
Jackson is an interesting character, and I suspect Santa probably wouldn't have voted for him. He wasn't very popular in Boston. In fact, the commandant of the Charlestown Navy Yard during this period realized all the other captains in the Navy hate this guy, and so he realizes he doesn't need to keep the other naval officers on his side. The person he does need to keep on his side is Andrew Jackson. So he has a figurehead of Andrew Jackson carved to go on the front of the USS Constitution. And a group of guys in Boston who don't like Jackson, hire someone to go out and cut the head off. And you can actually go to the Constitution Museum and see the top of Jackson's head and the lips that were in a museum in New York. But anyway, so Jackson, not very popular in Boston or in New England, is quite popular in Georgia. However, another problem Jackson has in Georgia is at the same time, Congress has passed a tariff law, and the state of South Carolina said this is unconstitutional. Congress can't raise the tariff this high. We're going to nullify it. So Jackson has South Carolina threatening to nullify the tariff. At the same time, he has Georgia wanting to fight the Cherokee. And Jackson knows if he does enforce the law against the state of Georgia, Georgia's going to join South Carolina.
Well, do you know why he was doing that with South Carolina, right? It was a personal thing.
No, what was personal about it?
His wife died. She committed suicide because.
She didn't commit suicide.
Or she died because she died from all the banter of gossip about her cheating on her husband. And
no, she and Jackson were married when her first husband was still living.
But the guy that lived in South Carolina, the government was had a wife who was more powerful than she was, and they just outed her, so he was doing revenge, right? He was
not
it was
really. Not really.
It's
easy to personalize things. It makes things more interesting. But
I learned that in school.
It might be a misinterpretation. He didn't get along with John C. Calhoun, who was the vice president, and also from South Carolina.
And it was a previous cabinet member.
Calhoun's wife who snubbed Jackson. Well, actually, didn't really snub Jackson. Jackson had his inner circle of advisors, and one was a guy named John Eaton, and Eaton married the daughter of his
the
hotel keeper. And Floride Calhoun thought that Peggy Eaton was beneath her and wouldn't dine with her, and so Jackson was offended because he realized his wife had been treated badly by snobs like Floride.
Right.
Okay. So anyway, getting back though to the Cherokee, Jackson's not going to enforce the law against the state of Georgia. And so the Cherokee are slated to be removed, but they have to sign this treaty first. And John Ross, who is the leader of the Cherokee, doesn't want to sign the treaty. And what happens is the Ridge, Major Ridge, and his sons do sign the treaty, even though they're not authorized to do so. The United States really isn't scrupulous about who signs the treaty on behalf of the Cherokee, and the Ridges seem as likely as anyone. So you have that whole issue of the Treaty of New Echota. Echota was the capital of the Cherokee Nation. They signed the treaty there. At the same time, as Georgia's dividing up the land, people are already moving onto the lands, taking the houses of the Cherokee, the land of the Cherokee, and the Ridges, because they've signed a treaty, get out to Oklahoma first, get the best land, and then the other Cherokee are being packed up and shipped off at the same time as the Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Creek are being sent off to Oklahoma in the 1830s. They have this massive operation to move these thousands of people west to Oklahoma to move on to land there, while there's this other flood of people in Georgia to get this land that the Cherokee have vacated or are vacating. And the Ridges actually wind up getting assassinated by other Cherokee when they're out in Oklahoma. Because they say it was illegal for you to sell the land, you shouldn't have done that. And Ross ultimately, he stays in Georgia as the leader of the Cherokee Nation. He is their chief. And he does, keeps negotiating with the United States government. So the Cherokee are removed from Georgia at the same time as the Creek, the Chickasaw, Choctaw are removed from Alabama, so on. Now, at the same time this is happening, up in Illinois and Wisconsin. Are there, by the way, any other questions for this whole episode where these thousands of people are moved, many of them in the winter, smallpox outbreaks, several thousand die in this transit to Oklahoma, which is a much different country than Georgia. And if anyone's been to either Georgia or Oklahoma, there already are people living in Oklahoma, much different way of life there, as every year the various people on the plains will follow the buffalo herd south, and the Cherokee mainly. Yes, Trevor.
I was just going to ask, did they face pretty much the same challenge in Oklahoma as Georgia from like the Republic of Texas? Because I feel like they probably would have wanted the same land.
Actually, the Republic of Texas doesn't yet exist. That's a good question. There are at this time beginning to be settlements of Anglos in Texas, encouraged by the Mexican government. Mexico has declared its independence from Spain, and it wants to have people living along this northern frontier. And so they give grants of land in this area north of the Nueces River to people like Samuel Austin. Initially, the Austins were from Connecticut. And they were hoping to get away from the money-grubbing American Republic and start anew in this tract they're given by the Mexican government. But most of those settlements are really between the Gulf Coast and the center of Texas. The real power in this area in Texas would be the Comanche and other native people who are, it's one reason the Mexican government wants to have these settlements there as a buffer against the Comanche, as well as to prevent the Spanish or the French from coming in. And so not yet, the Texans aren't going to be moving into Oklahoma. You're kind of right, the Texans are going to move wherever they can. But this area is not that hospitable. It's not a place, the East Texas is quite fertile. It doesn't have a lot of water. In fact, there's a story in the 1830s, Texas becomes a huge issue in the United States because by this time, there are a lot of Anglos in Texas. And now they're fighting a war against the Mexican government. And the issue is, should the United States support them? Should the United States annex Texas? And this becomes a huge political issue in the 18th. At the same time, this is happening with the Cherokee. But it's not Texas expanding north, it's Texas expanding west or fighting a war against Mexico, which doesn't give them the wherewithal to move north of the Red River into Oklahoma, which has been set aside as an Indian territory. Remember, the plains are filled with Native people. Let me just see if I can find a map showing the plains and how many Native people there are here. So you can kind of get a sense of this. The area where we are talking about with the Oklahoma, you see the Osage here. Let me see if there is a way to write on this. So this area is roughly Oklahoma, the Indian Territory. And these are fairly nomadic people here who live, relatively small settlements along rivers, but they spend a lot of time hunting buffalo in the summer months. The buffalo winter up in the Black Hills, way up here, and then come down the plains. And this area is roughly what becomes Texas. Caddo is part of Louisiana. So this area is roughly Texas. So it's not, later on there is going to be more of a connection with Texas, but not quite yet. But we are going to see, if you jump ahead to the 1870s, there's a land rush into Oklahoma. And so what had been guaranteed as an Indian territory now is opened up to white settlement. And so that's really the big change, but it's after the Civil War. You have that area now being opened up to settlement. There's actually, during the debates over Texas, someone in Congress, and it typically was people from the southern states who wanted to annex Texas. Because one thing you can grow in Texas is cotton. It has the same kind of climate where you're growing cotton in Mississippi, Alabama. It's drier in Texas, but yeah, you can grow cotton there. And cotton after 1820 is the leading American export. And someone in Congress says that Texas now is a harsh, uninviting desert, but Texas can become a flowering paradise. All she needs are water and a lot of good people. And Daniel Webster says, if I'm not mistaken, water and good people are all it would take to turn hell into a flowering paradise. So, yeah, Texas is going to become an issue of its own. Right now, Georgia is concentrating on getting the Cherokee out to Oklahoma. And the thinking is, this whole area in the center part of the country, you see some maps where it's called the Great American Desert, because there's not a whole lot there. The Great Plains are these wide open spaces. And it seems that the soil is, the prairie grass is too tough to break through and plant anything in. So it seems like this won't be an area open to the kind of farming that is being done on relatively small plots. Maybe bigger plots, or maybe ranching could happen there. And ranching is going to start in Texas really after, or just before the Civil War. But in order to be a successful rancher, and I'm really getting off of the subject of what's happening with the Cherokee and the Trail of Tears, you need a way of getting your cattle to market. And this area of the Great Plains wouldn't really be conducive to that because it's too far away from markets. Later on, with the development of railroads in the 1850s, 1860s, it will open up this area. In fact, the first railhead will be roughly here in Dodge City, Kansas. So the cattle from Texas will be driven north. And that's really what's going to introduce these folks to Oklahoma, this Indian territory that was set aside that's right between us and the railroad. Good question. Any other questions? Well, okay. Well, let's see. I mentioned that at the same time you have this removal going on in the southern states. It really is a southern phenomenon. There's a similar thing happening among the other native people slated for removal were native people who lived in what are today Wisconsin and Illinois. And let me just see if I can share some of this with you. Okay, so the here you see another of these maps, and you kind of can see where the native people were in the area along the Mississippi River. Let me just see if I can. This is the Mississippi here. And you see the Sauk, and they had joined with, they had fought against the English in the 7 Years' War, and they were allied. You can see with the Meskwaki here. They were not really friendly with other native people in this area, such as the Menominee and so on. You can see all the names of places here are in French, because this is when the French had moved into this territory quite early. And they live in this territory, you know, kind of stretching between the Mississippi River and the Wisconsin River. You can see there's the Fox River, and their real base was here along the Rock River, and the village of Saucona was their real central home, and it's on an island in the where the Rock River joins the Mississippi River. Now, in 1804, I mentioned this when we were talking with Gill Solomon, William Henry Harrison, who was the governor of the Northwest Territory, signed a treaty with them at St. Louis. And by this, the Sauk and the Meskwaki sell all of their land east of the Mississippi River for something like $2,200 worth of goods. And then every year the United States would provide them with another $1,000 worth of goods. And the deal was they were going to move west of the Mississippi River. But they weren't going to have to move west until the United States had surveyed their land and had started selling it to others. Now, the story is the Sauk didn't really understand the treaty, and they thought it was kind of a fraud. That what was said to them in negotiating was different from what was written down. And they not really ceded all of their land east of the Mississippi River. The treaty shows something else. You do find this often, that the treaty says one thing, the native people's recollection of it was something else. And in 1828, there now are more white people moving into this territory, and the United States starts surveying the land. And the Indian agent here, a guy appointed as Indian agent, I think by President John Quincy Adams, tells them they'd really better move west of the river. And there's a disagreement among the Sauk and the Fox about whether they should do this. Now remember, most native people, you know, the Cherokee had formed a government with a council. Most native people didn't have that. You had people who emerged into positions of leadership for different reasons. I mean, Gill Solomon was talking about how he became the Sachem, and it's very much like that in other Indian societies. There's an elder or someone who has a hereditary connection with the leadership group, so he is the person we look to as the Sachem. But then there are also war chiefs, people who lead warriors. There are religious leaders. It's very similar to our society, where we have lots of different people who are leaders, but you know, we do elect certain people, and then they are the ones who make these decisions. Now, Keokuk was one of the leaders of the Sac, and he had fought against the Americans in the War of 1812, as did others of the Sauk and the Fox. So 1804, we make this treaty with them. 1812, they join with Tecumseh's Confederation, and Keokuk had fought against the Americans, but then he had visited New York and Boston, and he said, there are a lot of them, and we really wouldn't be capable of fighting them. So the best thing to do, they tell us, move west of the Mississippi River. We probably should move west of the Mississippi. And he's not a chief. He's a good orator and very convincing. And another of the leaders is Black Hawk. And Black Hawk says, why should we go anywhere? We should stay where we've always been. And he and about 800 of the Sauks decide to stay. This is about a sixth of the
population decide to stay on the eastern side of the Mississippi. Black Hawk also had fought against the Americans in the War of 1812. Anyway, most of them in 1828 leave, go west of the Mississippi, and most of the others, like Black Hawk, go off hunting in the winter, which is what they always do. In the spring, you come back to plant. You come back so the women can plant. In the winter, you go off and you go on your winter hunt, and then you come back. And the hunting is all west of the Mississippi. You're hunting the buffalo who are out there and other animals. So in the spring of 1829, Black Hawk returns to the Saukanaw, Black Hawk and a number of other Sauk, and they find that their village now is occupied by white people who have moved in at the behest of the government of the United States and have settled down here. And, excuse me 1 second, I'm adjusting my other screen. So they find that their town is occupied by other people, and so they say they do have some kind of small disagreements with the white people who have moved in, but they go off in the end of the year on their winter hunt, and Keokuk tells the Indian agent, a guy named Forsyth, that he doesn't think they will be back the following year. However, they do come back the following year. And again, there are more white folks living there. And so there is some kind of problems with them. Anyway, the same time this is happening, you know, Black Hawk and his followers coming back. There aren't enough white people here really to be bothered by these Indians coming back to plant, and then the Indians leave at the end of the year. Now, at the same time this is happening, among other Native people in the area, there are long-standing disagreements, and the United States, in addition to trying to get Black Hawk and his followers and the Sauk and the Fox out of the area, are also trying to prevent big outbreaks of Indian war among Native people generally. So in 1830, May of 1830, the United States, there's a treaty party held at Prairie du Chien, which is an Indian gathering place in what is today Wisconsin, French term. And a group of Dakotas, and these are Sioux who live in what is today Minnesota, and Menominees, and these are people who also live in Wisconsin, come to this, and 15 of the Meskwakis, and the Meskwakis are allied with the Sauk and the Fox. The Dakotas and the Menominees kill them. They're attending this treaty conference. And then after this, the Meskwakis and the Sauks go off to retaliate against the Menominee and the Dakota. And they kill 26 Menominees, including women and children, back at Prairie du Chien. Now, the American officials here, and there are some American Army officers here and other Indian agents who have been trying to oversee this peaceful transition. They want to avoid a full-scale Indian war here. So they get the Menominees to stop seeking revenge. However, some bands of Menominees do go off and attack some of the Sauk and some of the Meskwakis. The United States government then orders the arrest of the Meskwakis who had killed the Menominees, which had precipitated this whole crisis, or had been the retaliation from what precipitated the crisis. You see, it's quite a complicated story here. People have long-standing disagreements with each other, and then they attack each other, which they have traditionally done. But now the United States is trying to prevent them from attacking each other, because the United States doesn't want them killing each other and does want to see the lands turned over to or sold in a peaceful way. Now, the following year, Black Hawk and his followers come back to Saukanaw, and this time they bring about 1,500 people with them. Remember, it started with about 80 or 100, a few hundred, and now it's 1,500, including Potawatomis, Native people who are from west of the Mississippi and now have allied with Black Hawk and his group, and they come here in early 1831, And at this point, the United States decides we're going to try to get the Black Hawk and his followers to stop showing up here every year. And the general in charge of American forces in the West is Edmund Gaines. And Edmund Gaines, he's based in St. Louis. And General Gaines brings the army up into Illinois. And he realizes if he wants to fight the Indians, he actually is going to need cavalry too. He doesn't have any horses. So he gets Illinois to raise a regiment of cavalry, militia cavalry, which Illinois does, because Illinois, like Georgia, is very much interested in getting these people out of the state of Illinois. So General Gaines gets the cavalry and brings his troops. Actually, troops are sent to an island across from Sachem, and too much brush on the island. The troops can't land there. Black Hawk and his followers are in the village across the river watching this happening. And when the troops can't land, they decide, okay, we'll go off and we'll try to drive the Indians out of Sachem. They get over there the next day, and much to their surprise, Black Hawk and his followers have all left. So Black Hawk and the others go and meet with General Gaines, and they say, okay, we won't stay on the east side of the river. Okay, every year they've been coming back, then they've been going off on their hunt. I would say, okay, we're not going to stay on the east side of the river. We'll all go to the west side of the river. And Gaines says, you have to promise that. Also, you have to promise that you're not going to keep trying to contact the English up in Canada. They keep sending emissaries up to Fort Malden, which is actually near Niagara Falls. I mean, they're on the border of the Mississippi River, but they're sending emissaries up to Niagara Falls to try to get the British to come in and support them. Remember, it's only about 15 years since the English and the Americans had fought a war over this territory. And now the Indians are negotiating with the English, or some are trying to get the English to support them here. And Black Hawk and the others say to Gaines, okay, we're not going to live on the east side of the river anymore. And Gaines says, don't try to contact Fort Malden, which is what it's called up in Canada. And both the Black Hawk and the Americans are trying to avoid having this become a wider war. And this is where we leave things off in 1831. After these attempted skirmishes, Gaines has brought an army, and that seems to be the end of it. But it isn't, because Neopope was a spiritual leader of the Sauk and the Fox. He's a civil chief, and he had gone off to Fort Malden, and he comes back and he tells Black Hawk, the British are ready to support us, and other Indian people are ready to support us if we decide to drive the Americans out of our territory. It's likely that the English did not promise this, that no other Indian people said this would be a good idea, but now it's this promise that the Winnebago, another native group who lived in what is today Wisconsin, or Ho-Chunk, another native group living in Wisconsin. They are related to the Menominee. And in fact, the Ho-Chunk have a prophet named White Cloud. His Indian name is Wabakishik. And White Cloud, according to Neopope, said that we're going to support you against the Americans. Now, by this time, Black Hawk and his followers are known to the Americans as the British band, because one thing they do as a way of taunting the Americans is wave the British flag. And nothing irritates Americans more at this time than someone waving the British flag. And also brings with it the promise that the British are going to join in this struggle against the Americans. And so Wabakishik, or White Cloud, does ultimately join with Black Hawk. He sets up at a place called Prophetstown, which is 40 miles or so north along the Rock River. And it's called Prophetstown because he is a prophet. And he has about 200 Ho-Chunks Miskowaks, Sauks, Kickapoos, Potawatomis, all living here. And most of these folks who are living in the Prophetstown are dissatisfied with their leaders really trying to appease the Americans, making deals with the Americans. These are Native people who don't like the encroachments of the Americans into this territory or this expansion. Now, for his part, this is actually White Cloud. White Cloud tries to discourage them from, he also wants to prevent hostility. He's a spiritual leader, doesn't want hostilities with the Americans, but also doesn't like the fact that the Americans are moving into this territory. Okay. So all of this is going on in early 1832. General Gaines decides really should arrest the Miskowakis who had killed the Menominees the previous year and precipitated all of this trouble. Now Gaines gets ill, can't go himself, so he sends a subordinate, Colonel Atkinson. And Atkinson arrives at Rock Island, which is an island on the Mississippi, at the Mississippi and the Rock River. And he writes to the governor of Illinois, and he says, you know, big problem with the Indians here. Can you send more troops? Now, the governor of Illinois really wants to get the Indians out. So now he hears an official from the United States government saying, hey, send more troops, and we can get rid of the Indians. And so the Illinois does. Illinois raises about 2,000 men who go off to fight Black Hawk. And actually, one of the men who goes off to fight Black Hawk is Abraham Lincoln, 22-year-old. He's elected captain of the militia unit from his town. So you have this force of about 2,100 men, along with about 600 or 700 soldiers from the United States Army, now coming to try to arrest the Miskowakis. Okay, so Atkinson meets with Keokuk and with another Miskowaki chief, and they hear now that Black Hawk has come into Illinois and he's on his way up to Prophetstown, and they send him a message saying, you'd better turn back. And Black Hawk refuses. Now, Atkinson doesn't do anything about this. Some other officers and some historians say, maybe if at this point Atkinson, instead of sending a message to Black Hawk saying you should not be doing what you're doing, actually sent force and stopped him, it would have avoided the war that's about to start, because you have Black Hawk on his way into this territory, this big force of Illinois militia and federal troops also in the territory, and you have all these different Indian groups ready to fight each other. But Atkinson, I'm sorry, if anyone is related to Atkinson, I have to tell you his reputation isn't really great as a strategist. Now, Black Hawk is moving into this area, and it's not really clear to him what his objective is. They might be going to Prophetstown, they might just be wandering around. No one really knows, including Black Hawk. And what happens in this is Black Hawk is learning from other Indians that he is not going to get the kind of support he anticipated. Remember, his emissary who had come back says that, oh yeah, the Potawatomis, the Menominees, the Kickapoos are all ready to join in this big fight against the Americans. Well, it turns out that's not true. And so what do you do now? Now, he's brought about over 1,000 people with him, including 500 warriors and about 600 non-combatants. That is, this is women and children who are all part of the Sauk, his group of the Sauk, who are moving into this area where they used to live, and it's unclear what their objective is. If Black Hawk were leading a war party, you would have seen warriors. But this is actually a party composed of lots of different people. And the Potawatomis actually want to remain neutral in all of this. He had heard they want to join his side, others know they want to stay on the American side. They really want to remain neutral, but they find it really difficult to do so. And in fact, they find that the white settlers don't trust them. Now, as Black Hawk and his force is moving into this part of Illinois, you do see a lot of the white settlers moving toward Chicago because they fear there's going to be an Indian attack. At the same time, the Potawatomis also move toward Chicago because they're afraid of being attacked, because one thing that usually happens in a war like this is when the Americans start going to war against the Indians, often they're not too careful about which Indians they're attacking. And the Potawatomis, even though they are neutral, are closer to the Americans than are Black Hawk and his followers, so they're likely to be attacked if a war breaks out. One reason the Potawatomis, other than those who are with Black Hawk, want to remain neutral. Okay. Now, outside of Chicago, a group of Potawatomi leaders get together and they declare that any Potawatomi who supports Black Hawk is a traitor to the Potawatomi. And two of the Potawatomi leaders who have been allied with Black Hawk tell him, we can't support you anymore. So this is really the state of things. Now, Black Hawk realizes he's in an untenable position. What he should do is negotiate a surrender with the Americans. Remember, earlier he said, we're not going to live on this side of the river anymore. Okay, we're going to go west of the river. Doesn't do that. Now he's back, and now he realizes, I can't fight these people. So he's preparing to negotiate a surrender. And as he is in this process, the war actually breaks out without him doing anything for it. One of the militia groups, led by a guy named Stillman, they led a scouting party, about 260 men north along the Rock River. And they set up camp at a ferry across the river. Actually, the ferry is kept by a guy who is half Indian. And the ferry is mainly used because there's a lot of lead mining going on in Galena, a town further north along the river. And this is the route the lead would take on its wagons going from the lead mines to Chicago and points east. So here you have a ferry, and there are white settlers living along the river. There also are native people living in the area. And Stillman and his militia group are here, and they hear a rumor that Black Hawk is only 25 miles away. No, the purpose of mobilizing is because Black Hawk had entered Illinois, and now we hear he's only 25 miles away. So Stillman and his party go off in pursuit, about 260 guys. And they do see a small party of Indians carrying a red flag, which they think means that this is Black Hawk's British band, because they carried the red flag. And there are different versions of what happened next. One version, this is the version Black Hawk gave, was that 3 of his people carrying a white flag went to the American camp to try to negotiate a surrender. And the Americans attacked them, locked them up, and then the second party of Indians that went to find out what happened with the truce were attacked by the Americans, who were fired on. The other version is the militia said, we never saw the white flag. Or if we did see the white flag, we thought it was a trick. That is, they were waving the white flag so that we would think they're ready to talk when instead they wanted to ambush us. Nonetheless, what happened was at near dusk, there is an attack by some of Black Hawk's forces on Stillman's party. And the militia is routing. Black Hawk and a relatively small group of native warriors rout this 260-man militia force. 12 of the militiamen are killed. Only 3 of Black Hawk's warriors were killed in this skirmish at Stillman's Run. It's called Stillman's Run now because this is presumably where Mr. Stillman ran. And what happens in the wake of this is when the regular troops arrive, they see that the 12 militiamen had been scalped, which is traditionally what Native people would do. When they go to war, they typically go to war not for the purpose of acquiring territory, but one thing they do is the warriors want to prove their valor, and one way you do this is by scalping the person you kill, or the person who is killed, and you bring back the scalp as a trophy. and collecting scalps. It's something that shows you are a warrior, and plus other stuff that these militiamen might have. If you come upon a body that's been scalped or had other body parts removed, what you see is the body's been mutilated. And so seeing the mutilated bodies really upsets the Americans, because why wouldn't it? And the Americans, and actually, when word of this gets back to General Jackson, I know Santa can predict how Jackson is going to react to this. He and the Secretary of War really want a tougher policy here. Actually, they want to get Black Hawk and make him an example to other Indians. What happens if you try to wage war against us? So now, though, Black Hawk's first problem is what to do now, because he can't really get back to the Mississippi to cross it. He's in the middle now of this hostile territory, and some of the Ho-Chunk who live further north invite him to come to a lake in southern Wisconsin called Lake Koshkonong, and that's an Ojibwe word which means place of catfish. And it's relatively secluded, so he and his followers, remember almost 1,000 people, go there to camp in this area where they'll be relatively safe. And they'll be, but however, to make sure that the Americans don't know where they are, Black Hawk sends out parties to raid in other places further away. So the American army will follow them to places where the Indians are not. So the first raid happens actually at a place called Buffalo Grove in Illinois. So quite a ways away from Lake Koshkonong. They actually kill an Indian, a guy named Durley, who's a farmer there. His body is found by the new Indian agent to the territory, and 3 days later, the Indian agent is killed. So you have Native people attacking far away from where the Native people are. And the American officials are really perplexed. And actually, the militia troops are quite perplexed about what is happening here with these Native people. And as the bands of Native warriors are going off and attacking in different places, you have the militia wanting to go home because their homes are now under attack. You have these raids all around Illinois and other parts of Wisconsin as Black Hawk and his followers are holed up at Lake Koshkonong. And then Black Hawk tries to make his way with all of his followers west to the Mississippi. They get as far as the Wisconsin River, and here the militia, the army does catch up with them, and Black Hawk realizes they are outnumbered. So what he and his followers do, his warriors, stall this much larger force of troops to prevent them, to allow the women and children to get across the river to safety. And then there's fighting against the militia. Later on, when guys from the regular army hear about this, they really admire the skill Black Hawk shows as a military leader in having his force hold off this big advance to allow the women and children to get across the river. And then Black Hawk goes north, and most of his non-combatants continue trying to make their way to the Mississippi. But by this time, the Indian enemies of Black Hawk are telling the Americans where they are. One of the big problems the Americans had was the Potawatomis and other of their scouts were giving them misinformation about where Black Hawk might be. They're actively trying to help Black Hawk escape. And Black Hawk and his forces do get to the Mississippi River, and here the Americans have brought a steamboat into play, the Warrior, and most of the women and children get to an island in the middle of the river while Black Hawk and the forces are fighting on the shore. And then this is at Axe Creek, and at Axe Creek, the Warrior then the ship Warrior turns on the Native people camped on the island and kills many of them in what's now called the Axe Creek Massacre. Some of the Black Hawk's warriors go south. Black Hawk and his forces go north. The ones who go south are apprehended by federal troops. and Black Hawk remains at large. He goes among the Ojibwe in what is today Minnesota, and ultimately he realizes one reason they had been trying to get back to the western side of the river, of the Mississippi River, was they had run out of food. They needed to get to the other side of the river so they could plant, because they didn't have enough food that people were going to start starving. And this is one of the persistent things you see happening in Indian warfare. The native people rely on planting in the spring, and when that's disrupted, you're going to start starving by the end of the summer, or by the next year if your food supply has run out because you haven't gotten on your winter hunt. So that is disrupted here. And in August, Black Hawk surrenders. He actually goes and surrenders to actually Winfield Scott, the new general in charge here. And Scott puts him under, he's escorted to the prison camp in St. Louis by 2 lieutenants in the United States Army. And one is Robert Anderson. And Anderson in 1861 will be the commander at Fort Sumter in South Carolina, which is attacked by the South Carolina militia. And this is really the beginning of the Civil War. Anderson Street on Beacon Hill is what then was Boston's black neighborhood. It's named for Anderson by the black community after Fort Sumter. And the other lieutenant is Jefferson Davis, who becomes, as you probably are aware, the leader of the Confederacy. Anyway, Black Hawk is taken to St. Louis, and from St. Louis he is sent to Fortress Monroe, which is in Virginia. And at Fortress Monroe, the plan is to have Black Hawk tried for fighting against the United States. He does meet Andrew Jackson while he's at Fortress Monroe, and they decide not to have a trial. Black Hawk will be escorted west of the Mississippi, but not before he makes a national tour. He is taken to Philadelphia and New York and other places where he's treated as a celebrity. I mean, you've just had this war in Illinois to try to destroy Black Hawk and this confederation, prevent them from crossing the Mississippi. In the East Coast, there is some feeling that Black Hawk is kind of a hero. He's fighting for his country. He actually had fought very well. This is the reason, by the way, why we have helicopters named for Black Hawk, because the United States Army, which fought against him, sees what a great warrior he was. And so he is returned back to west of the Mississippi, but as a hero after having led this war against the American forces. Not treated as a hero everywhere. In Detroit, when they stopped there, he's burned in effigy, because there they don't like the fact that Indians were attacking. So this war, in many ways, is somewhat emblematic of the other conflicts Native people and the Americans were having in this period. Now, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw all go relatively peacefully to Oklahoma. Black Hawk resists. And next time, we'll talk about another group of Indians. Next week, we have Anton Troyer joining us to talk about his book, Things You Always Wanted to Know, but Were Afraid to Ask. And also talk about the Seminole, people in Florida, who also resist this attempt to move them west of the Mississippi River. Has a very similar effect, although much longer war. In fact, until the 20th century, the Seminole Wars in Florida were the longest wars in the history of the United States. I realize I've started a monologue here, for which I apologize. Are there any questions or comments?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
On the discussion board, I know you want us to do 2 answers. All those discussions, is that due a certain time?
No, I'll post different questions. What I want you to do is every week or so address one of the questions. What I don't want is for you to wait till the end of the semester and then suddenly starting to write furiously. So it's meant to help you think as we're going along. I mean, I'll probably ask about what we've talked about tonight.
So do you want us to answer just one from the discussions throughout a week?
Over the course of the semester, you should probably do one every other week or so. Just
because I was like on the second one. So every week, so after this week coming up, you're going to have a different one?
Yeah, I'll ask different questions every week, and because some of your weeks will be busier than others, and others will be more interesting for you than
So
others.
like the defining Native Americans and the Cherokee, if we answered why are you interested in Native American history, we don't have to answer the other ones?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Really? Oh, okay. Well,
Why
I
are
just
you
wasted.
interested was just kind of a way to get you talking. But what I will do at the end of the semester, during the semester, is look to see how substantive your answers are and how often you're doing it. If all of your answers come in the last week of class, that means one thing. If over the course of the semester you are making interesting comments, that's
Well, if I answer the second one, do I have to answer next week's? I
no,
answered two out of
You
two
can,
of
no,
them.
no, you can, I mean, as I said, over the course of the semester, you should do about 7 or 8. So just keep that in
Okay.
mind. on average.
Okay.
Other questions?
Nope. The Chiefs are on tonight, so I want to watch the game.
Oh, okay. Well, the Chiefs, okay.
Well, I have.
That's
Yes.
appropriate. Yes, Chetty.
Sorry. How long does the I'm sorry. How long does the discussion have to be? How long?
Oh, I think I gave a number on the syllabus. It's, let me see if I can find it. Not extraordinarily lengthy, but not,
It's like 100 words.
I think that was your response to other people should be 100 words. So think about 200 or so, 300 words for your comment and your answer. And then if you're commenting on someone else, that should be about, I think, 100 words or so. If I'm wrong, I'll let you know. Okay.
I think it's 100 words for the discussion and it's 50 words for the reply.
That makes sense. So 100 words for your discussion piece and then 50 for your comment.
All right. Thank you.
Other questions?
Nope.
Okay. Well, I will see you all next week.
All right. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.